Welcome to the CBA Championship Series on ESPN. This is the Washington Avenue Armory. We're in Albany, New York. The best of 7 series gets underway between the Albany Patroons and the Wyoming Wildcatters. And welcome once again to the CBA on ESPN. Good afternoon. I'm Bob Lee. Our Championship Series preview on this day after. We hope you dropped your taxes into the mail. We will be taking a look at the 2 teams in this Championship Series. The incredible Albany Patroons and what they have done this year. The incredible Wyoming Wildcatters, who have beaten and defeated a number of teams and odds to get to this point. The coaches in this Championship Series, they are household names. Bill Musselman of the Albany Patroons, Cassie Russell of the Wyoming Wildcatters. And we'll take a look at the fans. They could be a very large factor. All sports fans have heard about Albany and what the Patroons have done this year. We'll also be taking a look now at what they have done. They have put the best winning percentage of the season up on the record board at nearly 89%. Better than the Lakers, better than the 76ers. They have done it more often than not by a large margin. 19 of their victories during the regular season were by more than 20 points. The head coach of Albany, Bill Musselman, he has coached the last 3 championship teams in the Continental Basketball Association. That is rather elite company, as you will see. And here on this home court, they have lost, the Patroons, only 1 game this year. It is the second-best home court record of any team in pro basketball history. Kevin Laughery, what about the home court? This is an old building. It's got lots of character and ambiance, and the fans are right on top of the action.
Bob, it's a great advantage because of the closeness of the fans. They're right on top of the play. When the team's not playing well, in a situation like this, they can really emotionally get the team up and get them to play better.
We saw that happen last week. Albany came from 17 down to win that game. They are decided favorites of this championship series. The opposition, the Wyoming Wildcatters, the Western Division champions of the CBA.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hello and welcome once again. It's a Good Seats Still Available, our curious little podcast journey each and every week into what used to be in professional sports. My name, as announced, is Tim Hanlon. I welcome you to the proceedings. Thank you tremendously for finding us. We know you've got a zillion choices out there in podcast land, and we're honored that you would allow us to entertain you and tickle your earbuds for a little while amidst all those other choices. So we appreciate it. I think you're in for a treat this week. It is a topic that we've wanted to get into for quite some time, and we found the excuse and the person to do so. We're going to get into the Continental Basketball Association. You may remember it as sort of this ragtag minor league, if you will, feeder, if you will, of the National Basketball Association. And it really was kind of in its heyday, if you could even call it that, in the 1970s and 1980s. It kind of limped along until the early 1990s. For various reasons, it died an untimely death. A guy named Isaiah Thomas sort of in the midst of all that. That's for another episode, another time. But our guest this week, David Levine, wrote a tremendous book that is sadly out of print. But as you'll hear in our conversation, we're going to be on some kind of quest to kind of get it reissued. The book is called Life on the Rim, A Year in the Continental Basketball Association. It's a book that's been sitting on my bookshelf for 20 plus years now. And it's always a topic and a person that I've wanted to talk to. And since I've been doing this podcast for 2 years, it's been kind of something that's been chafing at me as I whittle down my list to get into to conversation about. So David wrote this book, and it was a major publication. I think it was published by Macmillan. Yeah, Macmillan. And by the way, we'll have a link to it on Amazon. You can obviously get a used copy of it at our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode with David Levine. It's basically a year in the life of the Albany Patroons, which exists today in a even more minor league fashion. But the Albany Patroons of 1988-89, this is the season that David Levine followed the team on. Albany was probably among the, if not the, most successful of the CBA teams to play. There are a number of different cities, mostly smaller markets around the country. But the Albany Patroons did quite well. And as you're going to hear in our conversation, some very interesting names and personalities, including no less than George Karl, right? One of the great NBA coaches of all time, who made not only 1, but 2 appearances as coach of this team in the CBA, the Albany Patroons. And it's a story not only of like what was going on with that team and that city, the sport of basketball generally, but also this wacky thing called the Continental Basketball Association that in some cases even struggle to be a minor league. But it did have its fits and starts in sort of the big time and the big national spotlight, not the least of which was a little bit of that clip that you just heard at the opening of this little show here. That clip was from April 16th, 1988 from ESPN. That was Bob Lee, yes, a young Bob Lee with the coach, the old Nets coach, Kevin Lockery, calling the action for the CBA playoffs that year, including, of course, the Albany Patroons playing in that series. It's a fascinating conversation. We get into the history of the CBA, the Albany Patroons, if you will, the beginnings of minor league basketball. With our guest this week, David Levine, coming up in just a couple of seconds. Stay tuned. You're going to enjoy it, I guarantee. A quick promotional note. Let's get this out of the way. We've got a brand new sponsor, by the way, this week. We're going to, you listen for that during the mid-roll. It's our friends at the Great Courses Plus. You'll hear more about them there, but check them out and make a note of this. thegreatcoursesplus.com/good seats. And you're going to get a free month of an amazing array of college level lectures and teaching around a whole bunch of different topics, history and science and law and economics and hobbies and food and wine and professional and personal development. And they've got a great new course that is well worth the visit alone. And it's devoted to baseball. And it's called Play Ball, The Rise of Baseball as America's Pastime. It's created in partnership with the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. It is taught by the Hall of Fame's own Bruce Markison. And it's 24 lectures deep into all of the amazing, interesting, and phenomenally intriguing earliest days of baseball history, ranging from things like that we've talked about here on this show, whether it be the reserve clause or the early days of professionalism in baseball, how the ragtag amateur scene matured and became professional baseball, the intertwining, if you will, of politics in baseball, the intertwining of the wars that America has fought and the sport of baseball. Lots and lots and lots of very intriguing, highly entertaining pieces of information and education around the sport of baseball. Again, thegreatcoursesplus.com/good seats for your free month of that offering. It is well worth checking out. You're going to get a free month of the entire catalog of the great courses across all of their great subjects and topics. But if for nothing else, the entire baseball series of Play Ball, The Rise of Baseball as America's Pastime, is yours to try for free when you go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/good seats. It's streaming video. It's online. You can also use it as an app. It streams to any device. And when you use that app, you can download it, of course, if you'd like, if you're not near an internet connection. So you don't necessarily have to stream it. You can download it in advance. Or you can even use the app in audio-only fashion, should you just want to listen to some of these great courses. Again, thegreatcoursesplus.com/good seats, and you will get one free month of the entire Great Courses service. Well, I guarantee you'll enjoy it, if nothing more than for the baseball series alone, but I guarantee you're going to find a whole bunch of other topics you'll be interested in too. Again, one last time, thegreatcoursesplus.com/good seats. They are a brand new sponsor of ours, and we appreciate The Great Courses Plus for being a new sponsor of our little show. We love it, and we love you for not only listening, but hopefully enjoying this entertaining conversation about the Continental Basketball Association, the CBA, for God's sakes. Can you believe it? Finally, with our guest, David Levine. And here's our chat. This little show has spent quite a bit of time going down various memory lanes, mostly cul-de-sacs, focused on, teams and leagues and the various things that have emanated from them. In some cases actually still do. Maybe we'll get to that a little bit later in our chat as further or future incarnations or ongoing remembrances of said situations. But I guess before we sort of get into all the frivolity, why don't you tell our legions of fans, well, not legions, but it's a growing number, surprisingly, who you are, what you do for a living, and maybe then we can use that as the backdrop for how you stumbled into the topic that we're gonna delve into today.
Sure. My name is David Levine, rhymes with fine wine. I am a writer and editor. I've been a writer and editor my whole career, which is, well, the book's 30 years old, so it's unfortunately even more than that. in the early 80s and mid 80s, I was an editor and writer for for Sport Magazine, the late great Sport Magazine. And so I wrote about all kinds of sports and, of course, edited other packages of sports stories as well. And in the late 80s, I had contact with an agent that we had a sort of a working agreement with, that if ever a good book idea came along, we would work together. So in 1988, I moved to Albany to take another job, and shortly thereafter, my agent, David Black, was flipping through the newspaper, and he saw that George Karl had been hired as the new coach of the Albany Patroons of the Continental Basketball Association. And he thought, that sounds like a book idea. So he called me, and that's really how the whole project started.
Well, okay, so before we get into some of the specifics of that, what was it about George Karl that made that sort of the hook, I guess?
Well, George Karl was a known entity. He had been a coach in the NBA, 2 different teams up to that point. He was the youngest, I think at one point, the youngest coach in NBA history. He was 33, maybe, something like that. He had been in Cleveland and in Seattle, and he had had success in both places. But like all coaches, success doesn't mean you're not going to get fired at some point. He got fired from both jobs for various reasons. And so he was known. The CBA is not filled with known entities, or it wasn't filled with known entities. So that was kind of the hook. Here we have a guy who has been around the block a few times, and, he's an interesting fella. He's got NBA experience. Why would he take a job in this minor league in Albany, New York?
Yeah, that's interesting. So how then did you sort of get involved in this project? How does a book deal or process like this come into play once you and your agent stumble on this somewhat obvious or maybe not so obvious idea?
So the first job in most book projects is to write a proposal. And to do that, I had to, of course, get permission from the team. We conceived the idea that it would be pretty quickly a year with the team. I wanted to spend the season with them as close as I could and document what life is like in a minor basketball league. Stories about the minor leagues have always sold well, mostly baseball. Bull Durham, of course, being the prime example, and their books about minor leagues as well, but it hasn't been anything really about minor league basketball. So I approached the team owners and pitched the idea. Said I wanted to spend the season with them. I wanted full access. I wanted to travel with the team when I could. I wanted to be in the locker rooms. I wanted to be in the benches. I wanted to be at practices. And to their credit, they loved the idea, and they said, that's great, but you got to run it by the coach. So I went to the coaching office, the staff people, George Karl and his assistant, Gerald Oliver, and I pitched the idea to them as well. And again, to their credit, they loved it. They thought it would be a great idea. So from there, I did preliminary interviews. The season had already sort of started. It was they were in their sort of rookie training, pre-agent camp really is what you'd call it, before their actual training camp had started. So there were some players in town already. Practices were running. I got to interview George. I got to interview Gerald. I interviewed the front office staff and a couple of the players, and I put together a proposal very quickly. As I remember, it was probably done in a week. And it was, 25, 30 pages.
And I'm sorry, this is 1988 to 1989 season, correct?
Correct. Right. So this is the fall of 1988. The season started in October. So yes, this was all done in October of 88. So I put the proposal together. I sent it to my agent. He sent it to various publishers, and Macmillan Publishing Company bought it.
Now, you sound surprised. Why would you? Macmillan was, and I think still is, in some kind of imprint, a major publishing house.
Yeah, no, I mean, surprised is not the right word. I was pleased, of course. This was my first book project. So this was new to me. I didn't really know how it worked. I had no idea if it was going to sell or not. Even looking back now, I think it's great. Would a book like this sell today? I'm not so sure. The business has changed so much that I don't know if anybody would risk any kind of money on a book like this. Now, this wasn't big money. It was not a high risk for them. But still, they agreed. So, looking back on it, it was pretty seamless. It was almost like I don't want to say it was destined to be, but it all happened pretty quickly and pretty easily. So all the pieces kind of lined up, and it worked out really well.
So as you circle on Albany and this story, right? How much of your framing of this going into this is informed by knowledge of pro basketball, the CBA specifically, and/or how much of this do you sense is going to be about the team in Albany, and how much of this is going to be about this very interesting and checkered history thing called the Continental Basketball Association? Or is it even a bigger story than that, like redemption and falling out of favor and all that kind of stuff? What was in your head going into all of this process?
So the first part of your question, basketball was probably my least favorite and least well-known sport. I covered a lot of baseball. I'm a hockey guy. I wrote a lot of hockey stuff. There were other people at Sport Magazine who did the basketball, and it's never been my favorite sport. I don't really know all that much about it. So in some ways, that was good. I kind of went in blank slate. I've also always been interested more in the people and the lifestyle of sports more than the games themselves. So being a minor league, the object always was to show what the life was like. Well, wins and losses are all, well and good, but we wanted to show what it was like for these guys, these young men, some of them just out of college, some of them a little bit older with NBA experience. This coaching staff, one who was basically a minor league lifer, the other a seasoned NBA coach who would eventually go on to become one of the best NBA coaches in history. What's it like to live the life of a minor league basketball player? So my goal was to be as much a fly on the wall as I could. That wasn't hard, being that I'm 5'9" and they're all 6'4" and up. So it was pretty easy to hide among them. But I really was sort of trying to stay in the background, record everything that happened, and just put it down. It came to me pretty quickly that a diary format might be the best way to do this, because every day is different in a sports season. Some days you're home, some days you're on the road, some days you're playing a game, some days you're not playing a game. The mundane life of the average worker is not the life of a pro athlete. And when you throw in the life of a minor league athlete where there's no money and there's cheap travel and you're staying at third-rate hotels and eating fast food, this is just a wonderful world to explore. So that was the goal from the beginning.
Well, it sounds sexy the way you're setting it up, and I'm sure it was far from it once we get into the granulars. But maybe before we get into some of the specifics of things of how they unfolded, what of the CBA? What was this thing based on what you knew? It's pretty ragtag, and this relationship with the NBA has been, was on again, off again, not necessarily official. I mean, you're mentioning minor league basketball, right? The CBA has had a very checkered history, both before, during, and after this year that you're following the Patroons.
That's absolutely right. The CBA itself was named as such around 1982, I think, but it was actually sort of the evolution of the Eastern Basketball League, which had been around since just after World War II, as my memory serves, like 46 or 47. It was, a ragtag minor league based in the East, as the name would imply. They eventually got a team in Alaska, and funny thing was that the commissioner at that point thought they'd still call it the Eastern Basketball League, even though they had a team in Alaska. They thought that would generate some press. It's kind of like the Big Ten having 14 teams, I guess. But eventually they changed the name to the Continental Basketball Association. So the league itself had been around for a long time by the time it got to the early 80s. Well, actually, that was the late 70s. Albany got its team in the early 80s, around 1982. It was the brainchild of sort of the local politicians who wanted to inject a little more life into downtown Albany. They had this ramshackle arena called the Washington Avenue Armory that had a basketball floor on it, and they thought, well, if we get a team and we can, put 30 games a year, we'll bring people downtown, they'll support the bars and the restaurants, and it'll just add a little more life to the city. And it worked out better than they ever imagined, at least for a short time.
Yeah, well, you were walking into a team, actually, having gotten it started in 82 or so, that already had, if you will, if you could sort of say this with the CBA, a relatively stable level of success on the court, as well as support from the fans in Albany.
Yeah, absolutely. Albany was kind of the crown jewel of the league during those years. Players wanted to play here. The ownership was fairly financially stable, and that's no small thing in a minor league like this, where teams come and go sometimes in the middle of the night. It wasn't unusual for teams to fold up in the middle of the season or move in the middle of the season. Albany never had that problem, at least during the 80s. They had a great fan support. Albany is a good sports town. It's only 2 hours or so from New York City, and there are a lot of people here working for state government who came from New York and were big sports fans of the New York teams, and they were looking for something local. And the team had success right from the beginning, not in small part due to the fact that the second year they hired a coach named Phil Jackson, who turned out to be Phil Jackson. Back then, he was just a new coach at the Albany Patroons, and he delivered a championship in '84, which was, I think, their third season. So they were the toast of the town. And from that success, I mean, they always drew good crowds, but then they drew bigger crowds and they filled the Armory, and it really became the place to play in the CBA.
So do you think it was their success was the fluke of the success of Phil Jackson, or do you think some of it was engineered and smarts that kind of got them, or maybe a confluence of the two? Because I'm trying to figure out sort of, and I try to sort of piece this together as I go through the book and this entire season that you outline. How much of this is masterminding from a well thought out process and plan and ownership structure, and how much of this is frankly just luck, especially in a league that's been, at least at this point, relatively shaky?
It's mostly dumb luck, and the people behind the team might disagree with that, but I mean, you're talking about an ownership group of maybe two who have no experience in running a sports team. They were the Albany County executive and another guy who it was a former athlete who had a cup of coffee in Major League Baseball, but had no real experience running a sports team. They were making it up as they went, which is not unusual in a league like this. It's a lot of people who are just hoping this thing works, and oftentimes it doesn't. So it was luck. And, they hired Phil Jackson just kind of on a whim. He hadn't been retired that long. They had no real thought that he would accept their offer. They had a coach earlier, a guy named Dean Meminger, who you may remember. He was a New York Knick. They wanted to play off the Knick connection because Albany is close to New York and there are a lot of Knicks fans. So they tried Meminger. He didn't work out. So they contacted Jackson. And again, they really didn't think he would take the job because why would he? And it turned out he did. Now, is he going to be a good coach? Who knows? It turns out he's a great coach, and he's able to get some good players, and he delivers a championship team his second year. So, I mean, it was a good guess, I guess, is the best you could say. I wouldn't call it a well-thought-out scheme or plan, and I don't think the people behind it would do that either.
For our ardent listeners listening carefully, Meminger is a name from the the Women's Basketball League from the late 70s, early 80s as well. So trying to play some various carousel games, I guess. But that doesn't mean that the team is going to sell in the city, right? I mean, so there's got to be some kind of success or thought about how to promote the game. I mean, 4,000 seats, right, doesn't seem to be a lot, but I guess in Albany, it kind of does, right? And there's sort of this desire to sort of rehabilitate or bring people in or keep them in downtown for a series of dates, and especially in the cold winter months. Did the team just promote itself, so to speak, by playing so well, or was there really well thought out marketing as part of this mix as well?
No, there was not well thought out marketing. It kind of went word of mouth. Albany didn't have much else to sell itself. I mean, it's not like there was a whole lot of competition. There were some college teams in the area, but there were no other pro sports teams at the time. It's a good basketball town. Siena College and the University at Albany have decent basketball teams. Again, all the New Yorkers who moved up here who were Knicks fans. So it's got a good basketball fan base in general. But I think at first it was curiosity. Something to do when there isn't a whole lot to do, like you said, in Albany, New York. And the basketball was good. That was also an important part of it. I mean, you have to remember that in those days, this was the best minor league. It's not anymore, but it had people who had been in the NBA and may get back. It had other sort of younger players who eventually would make it to the NBA. So these guys were good players. This was seriously good basketball. Having success definitely helped. I mean, if the team had gone, 10-30 its first year and 12-28 the next year, would the crowds have come? Hard to say. Probably not. But the fact that they won, and then they won a championship their second year, it gave Albany a lot of pride. And as you said, the gym only sat 3,000 people. So it wasn't that hard to fill. You could find 3,000 people who are willing to spend whatever it was, $3, $4 a ticket, and see some pretty high-quality basketball on a winter's night.
So you're coming into this story a year removed from the team's second championship, right? So in 1988, the Patroons won the CBA title with their then head coach, Bill Musselman, who I guess went on to other things, right, to allow George Karl to step in.
Yeah, Musselman coached 1 year after Jackson retired. Jackson went on to coach the Chicago Bulls, far from retired. Musselman stepped in for a year, and I missed the best story by a year, probably. That year was apparently, by all accounts, the craziest, wildest, most intense year ever. Bill Musselman was essentially a martinet. He drilled players endlessly. He took no prisoners. He rode everyone, to near exhaustion, and he delivered a championship. So one of the players on that team was Murray Richardson, and after the year ended, and they took their trophy and they're saying goodbyes. The story goes that Richardson walked up to Bill Musselman and said, "I have two things to say to you. Thank you and fuck you." And then he walked away. So that was a wild season. But yes, so Musselman moves on. He becomes a head coach in the NBA. And that's what opened the door for George Karl.
Interesting, too. And if I have my data correct, it was, I don't know if it was his direct relationship or maybe the Patroons had one, but the Minnesota Timberwolves was where he went next, not immediately, but after a number of months. And it looks like a number of the Patroons from that championship season, including Sidney Lowe and Scott Brooks and a couple of others, went on to the Timberwolves to in those early years of that franchise in the NBA.
Yep, that's right. He took some players with him. So that also opened the door for some new players into the Albany franchise. So it really was, there were some holdovers. A couple of players stayed on from that year. But it was really a pretty much a new roster, new coaching staff, a new beginning for the Patroons. And, as you know, who knows how that's going to work. Now, getting George Karl, a known entity, certainly gave them a leg up, and it turned out to be a great move because having the NBA contacts and the NBA experience that George had, he knew who was out there. He knew the players that were available, and he managed to get some good ones.
All right, so you're moving to Albany. It's brand new for you, right? I'm assuming you probably had no previous experience with the Capital Region. What are you walking into, and where do you start?
Well, like I said, the first job was to go to the front office and say, I want to do this book, and get their okay, get the coaching staff's okay, sell the proposal, and then just start hanging out. I'd go to practices. I'd go on the road when I could. The advance wasn't big enough that I could go on every road trip, but I went on, I think, 3 out of 5 road trips, something like that, and then hang out with the players afterward. I'd go out with them, either to dinner. I'd interview them before. We'd travel on the road together, and I got to know some of them very well. And again, it was really just I wanted to be a tape recorder, and I would hang out with my little reporter's notebook and my bulky cassette tape recorder. Again, this is the 1980s, so the digital world hasn't come yet. And I would take notes. I would run off to the side and scribble notes when nobody was looking. I would have my tape recorder hidden behind my back during coaching sessions or, during games, halftime speeches. I would just click the red button and record it and try to be as inconspicuous as I could be. And then I would run home and transcribe all my notes and throw it into my little Mac 2 computer and type it up as I went.
And how much trust did players and administrators and coaches and people around the league give you? Were they sort of giddy at the fact that this was an actual book being devoted to them and the team and the league, or were they a little wary of seemingly another beat reporter, so to speak, that maybe they didn't feel like they wanted to share their most inner thoughts with?
Most people were very open because, again, in the minor leagues, when you say beat reporter, a lot of teams didn't have a beat reporter. They wouldn't get any coverage at all. Albany had, I think, one newspaper reporter, a guy named Tim Wilkin from the Albany Times-Union, who covered the team fully. The other local newspapers would cover it sporadically. The TV stations would report the game scores, but they almost never went to interview the players. You know, they'd send a cameraman and get some game film, and they'd do their 15 seconds of game reporting on the nightly news. And that was the best franchise in the league. A lot of places had very little to no exposure. So people were happy to talk. You know, it's not like the NBA where they got things to hide and they're surrounded by 15 reporters every minute. These guys wanted some press, a lot of them. Not all of them, of course. Some were a little wary, and some either were shy or just didn't want to participate. But for the most part, they were pretty open to me.
What did you find the quality of play to be, and the work ethic, and, you know, just the general day-to-day life of being a player in the CBA? Because one thing that among many that sort of emanate from this book is that it's a tenuous, you know, existence trying to make it to the show. You're not sort of living high on the hog, so to speak. Per diems only get you so far. And, you know, and you're also trying to string along this dream, which may or may not be in the realm of possibility. And maybe a little sense of sort of the constellation of folks that you're coming into contact with. How much of them are sort of living on a dream that's sort of never really going to happen, and how much of them are really kind of, you know, onto something and just need to be patient and work on what they need to do?
Yeah, well, that's why the book is called Life on the Rim. They're really on the edge, all of these people, the players and the coaches. The quality of basketball is good, but, you know, not quite good enough to make the NBA. Some of them do get called up. Back in those days, you could be signed for a 10-day tryout, essentially. Or, of course, you could be signed for the rest of the season. And players did go up for 10 days on occasion, but they often didn't stick. So they might be filling in for somebody who was injured. So the point is, you know, they were good enough to be the 10th, 9th, 8th guy on the bench in the NBA, which means they're really good. But they weren't quite good enough to stick for a variety of reasons. The lifestyle is really what interested me and what I think is the key to the book, because these guys are making, I think, about $450 a week. Per diem is, you know, they're eating at Popeyes and McDonald's. There's one game where the opposing team brings in pizzas, and the coach yells at them, all right, everybody gets one piece, because otherwise it won't be enough for everybody else. And that's their dinner. Now, these guys are, you know, 6'2" to 6'11". They've just played 48 minutes of serious basketball, and they get one piece of pizza after the game. It's tough, and it's draining, and there's an expression that everybody talked about called the CBA blues, which is when, you know, you're in the depths of winter. It's January, it's February. You're slogging through dismal towns and airports and van rides, and you're not making any money, and you're seeing other players maybe get called up, and you're not getting called up, or maybe you're not even playing, and you're wondering, is this all worth it? You know, there's one scene where the team got snowed in at O'Hare Airport, and the league wouldn't, you know, charter them a plane, of course. They didn't have the money, so they basically had to walk back and forth between Eastern Airlines, no longer with us anymore either, and some other airlines trying to get a flight to their next destination. And one of the players is dragging his luggage, and he's saying, I can't believe I'm doing this. I had a good job at UPS. My agent, you know, said, try one more year, give it a shot. And now he was speaking in a little more colorful language than I am, but he's, you know, basically saying, this isn't worth it. I don't know why I'm doing this. This is crazy. He ended up being called up to the Celtics later in the year, so it was worth it for him, and he got signed to a season contract of $100,000 a year. So, you know, for him it worked out. But for all the other 11 or 12 or 15 players who came through the Patroons who didn't get called up, their life was slogging through airports, dragging their luggage, checking into Holiday Inns and Howard Johnson's motor lodges, getting stuck in snowdrifts, having vans break down along the highway. And that's when the CBA blues sets in, and that's where I think the book really, you know, did what I wanted it to do, was to show that the glamorous life of pro sports is in many ways not glamorous at all.
All right, time to pay a couple of bills around here. We welcome with open arms our friends at the Great Courses Plus. How can I best describe the Great Courses Plus? How about this? Unlimited video learning with the world's greatest professors. Yeah, it's an amazing video streaming site. Available in app form. You can watch it online. You can stream it to any device, and it is courses from some of the best professors and lecturers around the country in a whole host of topics. Almost like college in a box, if you will. You know, things you want to learn about history or science, food and wine, hobbies, everything that you might be interested in without the tests, if you will. There's no grading whatsoever, but some amazing coursework, including their first real deep dive into the realm of sports, which I think will be especially interesting to our listeners. And here it is. It's called Play Ball, The Rise of Baseball as America's Pastime. And it's created in partnership with the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. It is taught by the Hall's expert there on all things baseball history, Bruce Marcuson. And there are 24 lectures, maybe even a few more if I'm not mistaken, that sort of traverse the early history of the sport of baseball in this country. A bunch of things that broach to topics that we've talked about here on this little show. There's a lecture devoted to the early era of amateur baseball clubs, and another lecture devoted to how they coalesced into finally forming what now is known as organized baseball. There's a lecture devoted to the World Series and how that got developed. There is an episode devoted to the early ballparks of baseball called Sacred Ground. And it's just a whole host of things. Black baseball before the Negro Leagues. You name it. About the earliest days and the formative years of baseball's history. You will find it in this tremendous course. Again, it's called Play Ball, The Rise of Baseball as America's Pastime. And again, it's created in partnership with the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum, and it is yours to try and listen to and view for free. Yeah, for free. An entire month's worth of the Great Courses Plus is available to our listeners. When you go to this great here website, it's called thegreatcoursesplus.com/good seats. Again, that's thegreatcoursesplus.com/good seats. And using that URL, you will get, nowhere else will you get this offer, 1 free month of the entire service that the Great Courses Plus offers. That's all the topics, all the different courses and lectures. You can download them. You can listen to them in audio-only format or watch them in video streaming on any device you want. But if you do nothing else, take advantage of that free month and watch every episode of Play Ball, The Rise of Baseball as America's Pastime. I guarantee you'll find it interesting. I'm about 3 or maybe and a half, I guess, lectures into it, and I can't wait to finish them all off. Again, that's thegreatcoursesplus.com/good seats. You're going to get a free month of the entire Great Courses service, and it's only yours for a limited time. So give them a try. We appreciate your doing so, and we also appreciate your listening to the rest of our conversation right now. Maybe it's a good time to sort of discuss from your perspective what the relationship was between the CBA and the NBA. I think there's a generation of basketball fans that kind of always thought that the G League or the D League, whatever it was, what's called over the number of years, which is a relatively new construct of the NBA to sort of create, develop, perhaps maybe someday become a true parallel alternative to the college basketball machine, but that's owned and operated by the NBA today. This was not the case back then.
Correct. This was an independent league. They got some money from the NBA. The NBA supported them, for which money each NBA team had rights to certain CBA teams' players, and they could, when they wanted, call up a player and again sign them to a 10-day contract, or if they wanted to, sign them for the rest of the year. Players come and go all the time. That's another thing that makes the CBA so dramatic, is that this 10-man team probably had 20 guys over the course of the season come and go. They're in, they're out almost daily. Sometimes they don't even last more than a day or two. They come in, they're called up to the NBA, they're traded, they quit. It's a very precarious lifestyle, and that's part of being life on the rim. They don't know who's going to be here the next day. Sometimes, if players get hurt, they got to find somebody else. Sometimes on short notice, they might call in a local player. In fact, Albany called in Lowe's Moore a couple of times, who you mentioned. He had played for Musselman and for Phil Jackson, but he was pretty much retired. He still lived in the Albany area, and a couple of times George Karl would just call him up and say, Lowe's, you want to go for a run tonight? And he'd show up, and he'd put on a uniform, and he'd play. So that's the kind of lifestyle, these guys are living.
How would you describe the composition of the player pool? A bunch, I guess, more pointedly, what's the ratio of players on the way up versus the ratio of players on the way down, or never really going further?
That's a tough one. I would say most of the players, it's probably an even split. There are a couple of guys who are older and coming on the way down. The Patroons signed a guy named Greg Ballard, who had actually won an NBA championship with Washington, I believe, or Baltimore. I can't remember which one. So, he was in his mid-30s. Obviously, the best days of his career were behind him, but he still wanted to play, so he showed up. That's a guy I guess you'd say is on the way down. Kelvin Upshaw was a young guard who had a good year or two, but didn't really stick. There was a guy named Vince Askew on the Patroons this year, who he was definitely a guy who was on the way up. He was probably the best natural talent that the Patroons had that year, but he had some issues coming out of college. He had some motivational problems. George Karl kind of whipped him into shape, and he ended up having a pretty decent career. He was never a star in the NBA, but he played half a dozen years with a couple of teams and ended up making, a nice living and becoming a solid NBA player. So, you had them both. And then there was the really interesting guys were the guys who weren't going anywhere. And those were the guys that I liked to write about. They maybe didn't have a great college career. They wanted to see if they could just hang on a little bit longer, maybe make a little money at the CBA, and if not the NBA, maybe get a contract in Europe, which of course was an option for many of these players, and European leagues paid very well, as they still do. So some guys did go to Europe during the course of the year. But the majority of these guys, this is kind of the end of their line. They play a year or two in the CBA. They realize this is as good as I'm going to get. And then they go get real jobs. You can't blame them if they're just out of college or 22, 23, 24. You give it a shot. But as we all know, being a professional athlete is not easy, and being an elite professional athlete is nearly impossible. So most of the guys in the league are guys you've never heard of and you never would have heard of. They were just basically trying to carry their career as far as they could, and CBA was as far as they could.
All right. Well, so another interesting aspect of all this, right, is the CBA had a bunch of different sort of rules to kind of, distinguish it a little bit from sort of the sort of garden variety NBA game and maybe even aid a bit in player development, right? So one of the interesting facets of that, perhaps the most in my mind, is the sort of playing for every quarter, basically getting credit or points for winning a quarter versus maybe sandbagging a game if you're way behind, and, it just becomes boring for the fans, if you will, if that's, if it's effectively a game that's, kind of already over. But the idea of making every sort of quarter of the game interesting and worth something.
Yeah, the league tried really hard to keep it interesting, like you said. And the commissioner at the time was a guy named Jim Drucker. And George Karl hated all these silly gimmicks. He called them Druckerisms. And like you said, the games weren't strictly won or lost. There was a point system. You get a point for every quarter you won, so up to 4 points, and then 3 points for winning the game. So a game, if you sweep all 4 quarters and you win the game, you get 7 points. The object, as you said, is to keep people interested. If you're getting blown out in the third quarter, you still have a chance to get that 1 point in the fourth quarter. They wouldn't let anybody foul out also, mainly because the rosters were so small. But if a guy got to his foul limit, he could still play, but the other team got technical free throws. So people really never fouled out of a game. So they tried all these gimmicks. They had fan gimmicks. They were the league that invented the $1 million half-court free throw shot from a fan during halftime. It was all, in some ways, they were a little advanced. You see a lot of this stuff in minor leagues all over the place now. You go to a minor league baseball game, and you can't get through a half inning without some fan interaction, game, or contest. The CBA tried all of these things. Some worked, some didn't, but they did try to keep the fans interested. Yeah, they didn't want arenas to empty halfway through. Their crowds were already small, so they tried to keep people interested, and for the most part, it worked pretty well.
Yeah, that point system's interesting for our eagle-eyed soccer fans out there. The old North American Soccer League did quite a bit of that. Obviously, a sport that could easily, and still frankly does, sort of devolve into sort of defensive battles of 0-0 scores. The idea of adding, I think it was 6 points for a win, and then you get a point for each goal scored. So even if you're behind in the game, you can still at least get a point or 2 or 3 in a losing effort. And in many respects, I think you could sort of look at this as being helpful for some of today's games too. These are a little bit ahead of their time, but in terms of fan excitement and God forbid you actually think about now with betting becoming more of a mainstream and legal thing. Betting is being done on these kinds of things anyway. How many people are going to score points in a particular quarter and that kind of stuff anyway. So it's interesting. I think Adam Silver in his commentary a couple of days ago, sort of about state of the league and stuff, he was kind of pinching himself or knocking on wood, saying that things are going pretty darn well for him right now and the league. But, I think they're very, very interested in experimenting with a whole bunch of things. And, arguably you could look back to some of the interesting innovations of the CBA and maybe, in a tournament fashion or maybe in the D or G leagues, give them another whirl.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as we all know, our attention spans are short. There are distractions everywhere. People can turn on a dime. If you're not entertaining them pretty much constantly, they're going to look elsewhere. They got cell phones, they got their computers. I don't want to sound like a crotchety old man, but the fact is that it's hard to keep people's attention. So yes, they have to try everything, including the biggest leagues, the NBA, the NHL, Major League Baseball. They're all throwing out every bell and whistle they can think of to keep players or keep fans' attention.
All right, a whole bunch of things. We go sort of randomly here. So what about travel? I look at the league and the way it was constituted in the 1988-1989 season, and the Patroons winning the Eastern Division. They were part of the six-team Eastern Division, and there was another 6-team division in the West. But I can already sense what, shall we say, interesting travel might have been. You look at the Western Division; their teams are relatively geographically close to each other. I think. Quad City and Rapid City, South Dakota, and Rockford, Illinois, and Cedar Rapids, La Crosse, Wisconsin, Rochester, Minnesota. Those feel like busable and or maybe prop planeable. But when you look at the Eastern Division, I don't know how much you remember this, but Albany and Tulsa and Pensacola, Topeka, Kansas, Charleston, South Carolina. I mean, it seems like the burden was greater on the Eastern Division teams, inclusive of Albany, for travel relative to their Western Division brethren.
That's true, but also the league had gotten to the point now where the teams in the East could all fly. The early days of the CBA, and certainly in the Eastern League, it was a bus league, bus and van. Sometimes the players would drive themselves and the coaches would drive, and nobody had enough money to fly. The Patroons flew everywhere. Now, part of that includes, because they're playing in small cities, that means flying to Chicago and then taking a bus or a van to Rockford, Illinois, or flying to, a bigger city and then taking a bus to the nearby smaller city. The travel was really tough. In fact, one of the things that I remember from those days was just how taxing travel is on athletes. I mean, it was taxing on me, and I wasn't a full-time athlete. I wasn't practicing. I wasn't playing. I wasn't 6'9" trying to sit in a coach airline seat after a game. It's exhausting, and especially when you do it on the cheap, like the CBA did. You're in planes that are late. They get snowbound. You get thrown into a van. There was one time where we were taking a van to a game and the tire blew, and it was somewhere, I think it was in Iowa, and it was below zero, and no cell phones, and they're on their way to a game, and what do? You're stuck on the side of a highway. It's 12 below zero. The driver was some kid from the other team. He says, "I'll go get help." He jumps out the van. He flags down a car, happens to have a pretty woman driving it, and off he goes. So here's the team all sitting in this bus on the side of the road. No idea if they're ever going to see this guy again. They could be there. They could still be there. They're taking bets. Are we ever going to see this guy? And one player says, no, I think he just quit. We're never going to see him. They don't know what to do. Now, eventually the kid did come back with a replacement van and got them to the arena. But that was not an unusual occurrence.
Yeah, I guess the meals weren't necessarily of the highest quality to perform at an elite level, if you will, on the court either, right?
No. It was fast food all the way. They'd leave a game, they'd head to the airport, and they'd take a vote: Burger King or Popeyes, and whoever got the vote won. It was junk food. It was hotel food. It was whatever they could scrounge. They did not get pregame meals. Again, maybe the opposing team would throw a pizza at them after the game if they were lucky. Now, in Albany, there were local establishments that would help them out. They'd give them meal coupons. There were a couple of bars and restaurants that would cater to the team, and all the teams have this. Of course, there are always boosters in every town that want to support the team and help out. So they would help them find apartments and, maybe knock something off the rent. They would give them coupons so they could eat half price. They might throw, a free meal at them now and then, or a couple of free beers after a game. But they're living really hand to mouth. I mean, these guys would run out of money often. They would hound Gerald Oliver, who was the assistant coach and essentially the manager of all the business that had to be transacted, letting George Karl just be the coach. And they were always complaining about where their money was. Albany, as you said, being a financially stable organization, they got paid when they were supposed to get paid. Not every team could say that. Checks are often late. Checks might bounce. That wasn't true in Albany, but it certainly was true around the rest of the league. So it's a hand-to-mouth, again, very unglamorous lifestyle. And I think the book, I hope, captured a sense of that.
Well, explain to me then the sort of how you found George Karl in all of this as you started and as the season ran on. Because, here's a guy who, 2 years prior was, with Golden State in the NBA and in the playoffs, right? Playing against the LA Lakers in the semifinals and, arguably on the ascendance, right? And
yes.
The following year, you had Chris Mullin, who was, the then sort of star in waiting with the Warriors, who was having his own issues, I guess, with rehab, alcohol and all that kind of stuff. And, and the players, his team was not nearly as good or performing as well as that playoff season the year before. There's debate whether he was fired or he quit, but here he comes and shows up in Albany, right? Which I'm sure is what attracted you and your publisher and your agent to the story. But how do you find him psychologically at the beginning of your journey, and maybe perhaps as the season progressed, as you sort of outline in the book? Because I can't imagine that at least in the beginning, it's necessarily one of unbridled optimism, given where he came from.
No, well. George at least had coached in the CBA before he, became an NBA coach. He was a coach for 3 years in Montana. This wasn't entirely new to him. But after whatever it was, 3 or 4 years in the NBA, he was a little shocked a lot of times. And there's several scenes in the book where, he just, in fact, here, I'm just flipping through the book and here this sort of explains how he felt. This is after they won a game in Albany. But the CBA, we haven't really talked about the style of play. As good as these players are, they're not NBA caliber in many ways, and one of those ways is structure. This is a league where everybody wants to shoot. It's pretty much street ball in many ways. A lot of three-pointers, a lot of selfish play. Defense comes and goes, mostly goes. Everybody wants to score. Now, of course, the NBA doesn't work that way. So after this one game, they win, but, and I'll read from here, it says, for Karl, the victory is draining. Everything he believes in, patience, defensive control, sound fundamentals, keeps being tested by lousy refs, selfish play, and outrageous threes. As he sits on a folding chair, beer in hand, suffering from the flu, just outside the locker room in the basement of the Armory, amid reporters and fans and players and friends, Newsom, who's a player on the other team, walks out of his locker room. He's still in uniform, carrying his game shoes in one hand, ready to board the van back to the hotel. He limps gingerly up the stairs, alone, looking like a lost child. Karl watches him go. He sips at his beer and leans back in his chair. He shakes his head and says softly, "A different world." So he was often trying to come to grips with where he was. There were times when he would take it humorously. There was one time I remember him saying, "I can't believe I'm living in a Fellini movie." And there were other times where he just got so fed up with it that he really couldn't put up with it. Another trip, we were on a bus somewhere, and the players were bitching and moaning and yelling at each other, and the bus stops at a red light, and he tells the bus driver to open the door, and he just gets out and he walks back 2.5 miles to the hotel because he just can't put up with it anymore. So that was a fascinating look, because the juxtaposition of his NBA experience and the CBA bullshit, which he called it all the time, drained him and wore on him. And part of his mission the whole season was to get these guys to understand that if they wanted to make the NBA, they had to change their attitudes, they had to change the way they played, and they just basically had to change their whole manner. Some guys could, a lot of guys couldn't. And that was his battle as a coach, but it was also a battle that he sort of fought internally, trying to keep everything as professional as he could and as he knew it had to be in a world that just was not professional at all.
Yeah, there's a picture in the book. George Karl is it's in between plays, and he's got the team sort of around him. He's on his knee, and he's trying to explain a couple of things to the players. And the caption says, "Coach Karl stresses defense, discipline, and teamsmanship, 3 elements of the game rarely seen in the CBA."
Yep, that's it.
Which is, and then you sort of, you got to think that you start questioning life in general. But so let's talk about sort of the camaraderie and the spirit. What is and we'll get to some of the individual players that stand out in your mind in a second. But how would you describe sort of the day to day? Was it drudgery? Was it always never anything? Never if something was different every day. Were people excited or enervated by the process? You mentioned obviously people are living on the edge or on the rim, so to speak. But what's sort of the general sort of tenor of the day-to-day, both in and on and off the court? Happiness, sorrow, fear, what? Yes,
all of those. And they can change in an instant. And it depends on the player. When the team is winning, people are happy. When the team is losing, people aren't happy. That's true, with any team. When players are playing, they're happy. When they're not playing, they're unhappy. Everybody wants to play more. Nobody gets as many minutes as they want. So there's always, and that's true in the NBA too, and that's true in high school. Everybody wants to play, nobody wants to sit on the bench, and everybody wants to win. So over the course of a season, you're going to have ups and downs, to use the cliche, and everybody goes through it, including the coaches. So it's never the same. Like I said, our workday drudgery is kind of the same every day. We go to work, we come home, it's the same old stuff. But in basketball, especially, when guys were fighting for their basketball lives, they're all basically on 1-year contracts. They've got a 6-month job, and they don't know what they're going to do at the end of those 6 months. Everything is very heightened. It's very intense. So, again, when things are going well, then they're happy. When things aren't going well, they're not. And being maybe less professional than they should be, a lot of them aren't afraid to bitch and moan and cry and complain and threaten to quit. This team actually was fairly close. In fact, as I remember, Gerald Oliver, who had been in the league for a long time, said it was probably the closest team he had ever coached. So the players all got along with each other for the most part. They weren't necessarily mad when, player X played more than player Y. They were more mad at the coaching staff or themselves or the situation or just the CBA blues had gotten to them. So part of the book, just flipping through it again, it's remarkable how moods change. One day I could be writing just how down and depressed and miserable everybody is, and the next day it's a new day and they're ready to go and they're in the gym and they're practicing and they're having fun. And that's sort of a general way that athletes sort of approach things. To be a good athlete, you have to be able to put yesterday behind you and focus on today. And that's kind of how it went.
How about your mood through all this?
My mood was I was just having so much fun. I was a high school athlete and a college club athlete, but I'd never been a pro, obviously. So to be, I've covered pro sports, to actually be a part of the team, though, not actually a teammate, but to be able to be in on the meetings and in the locker rooms and on the buses and on the planes. It was a blast. It was fun. The travel did get tiring, like I said, but it certainly was less tiring for me than for these guys. I didn't have to play a 48-minute game. I wasn't 6'6". It was just great. I loved every minute of it.
How about some of the players that stand out in your mind from that season, both whether they were with the team for the entire season or various cups of coffee? Any particular names or situations that they were involved in sort of stand out in your mind, and you're in the haze of, I don't know, what, almost 30 years now of this book?
Yeah, well, the one player who kind of became a through story was a guy named Steve Sharina. And he had just come out of St. John's University. He had played on the great St. John's teams with Chris Mullin and Bill Wennington, but he was essentially a bench warmer. He didn't play much. So he's the classic CBA guy. He just wants to see how far his basketball can take him. He comes to tryout camp. He doesn't get signed or drafted by the CBA. The CBA could also draft players. We haven't talked about that, but like the NBA, they could draft player rights. He was undrafted. He came to tryout camp. George Karl had never heard of him, and he just impressed everybody enough to make, training camp. And he just kept playing well. George Karl kept saying, I want to cut this guy, but he won't let me. Steve is, I think, 6'4", 6'5". No great skill that stands out, but real strong heart, real hustle, great team player, really nice guy. He was a really likable kid then. He's a great 50-year-old man now. I just saw him a couple of months ago. So he's the classic CBA story, and he made it through the whole season, even though, as at one point in the book, George Karl said, Steve, I almost cut you 8 times this year. And Steve said, yeah, you almost cut me before I even showed up. Somehow he managed to hang on, but it was a difficult season. He was benched a couple of times. He was put on injured reserve, which is sort of a sneaky way that the league got players in and out of lineups, even though he wasn't really hurt. They would pretend that somebody was hurt and they'd bring in a new player. ESPN had a contract for a couple of games a year, and there was a game in Albany that ESPN was going to televise. And his girlfriend had come up from New York, and I think her parents or his parents had come up from New York. And right before the game, he was basically put on injured reserve. And he didn't even stay for the game. He got in his car and he drove home, and he was, really depressed. He thought, well, maybe this is the end of my basketball career. Didn't turn out that way. He came back. George put him back in the lineup, and he had a string of really good games. But again, he was sort of in and out of the lineup the whole way, but he made it through the whole year. And so his story is sort of indicative of what, to me, the CBA is really all about. Yeah, there are some guys that go to the NBA. Yeah, there's some guys that are coming back from the NBA. But the guys like him who are just really trying to hang on and see what they can make of their basketball lives was really interesting to me. And it happened that he's also a terrific guy. And like I said, we stayed close after, and we've run into each other a little over the years. So his story stands out with me. Other players, I mean, you could pick any one of them. I mean, you flip through the book. Anybody come to your mind that you remember standing out?
Well, I think Dirk Minifield, Doug
right.
Lee. Some of these are names that you think, or Greg Grissom. I mean, these are names of folks that they do ring a bell, but not quite sure how and why. But some of them had their cups of coffee or multiple cups of coffee or their 10-day contracts in the NBA, and some kind of just became sort of the journeyman. I guess that's just sort of the story of minor league sports generally, but I guess I'm just sort of fascinated with sort of, the phenomenon on how, players can get, themselves up for games and the travel and the rigor. They're certainly not getting paid, but I got to think that's, for folks, especially looking to sort of, ascend upward, it's a great learning opportunity. And frankly, you can't let down, because you never know when there's going to be an NBA scout in the stands. Frankly, I think in some of these cases, you should be able to pick them out because, the relatively thin crowds in some of these cities, but you never know, right? And it's also, you never know the situation of the NBA teams and their situation where they need a player, toot sweet, right? And it's that one time, that one thing. And this book is filled with some of those little sort of, I guess, I don't want to call them chance encounters or situations. But, to your point, like earlier, the title of the book, right? This is, you're living on the edge. Sometimes that can go in your favor. And frankly, more often than not, it tends to not go in your favor.
That's right. And that's what George Karl tried to preach the whole season, is that people are always watching you. You don't know when your chance is going to come, and you have to be ready, both physically, of course, but also emotionally. He was constantly fighting them to not let the CBA blues get to them, to not get down, to stay professional. He was always comparing what was happening in the CBA to what happened in the NBA, how practices were so much more intense, how the scouting was so much more intense, how the competition was so much more intense, how you can't get away up there. This is telling. He would call the NBA the league, and he would call the CBA this league. And that was all the difference in the world. He'd say, if you want to get to the league, you have to do X, Y, and Z. Now, all this bullshit that you're having to do in this league is not going to do you, it's not going to serve you well. And if you don't overcome that and get your heads on straight and do what I tell you to do, you're never going to get out of here. Of course, talent has a lot to do with that, but it's often attitude. It's certainly luck. You just have to be the right kind of player for the right kind of team at the right moment. But a lot of it is attitude, because when a coach or a GM calls George Karl and says, I need a point guard for 10 days. Who do you like? George is going to tell him, who's playing well. And that's how it worked throughout the league. The GMs would call the teams and say, we need a power forward for 10 days, or we need a practice player, whatever it is. Who's showing up? Who's doing it right? And he would try to get them to keep their heads on. And it's just not easy. Now, again, these are young men. They're not, a lot of them aren't fully mature. Some of them may have been in the league and they're a little pissed off that they're not, so they got some attitude. Some think they should be in the league and they're not. They're not playing as much in the CBA as they think they should. And some are just goof-offs, like you mentioned Greg Grissom. He's a guy, he's 6'11", white guy who called himself a slow, fat white guy, which is what he was. But he had some good skill. He was a decent center, power forward. When he put his mind to it, he could be a force on the court, but he never stayed in shape. He drank too much. He was constantly being belittled by George Karl. Get in shape. Some guy calls me from the NBA, and he says, I hear Grissom's fat. What am I going to tell him? And Griss would say, yeah, I know. I got to get in shape. Maybe tomorrow. And he never did. So here's a guy that might have, with a different attitude, might have had more of a career than he did. The league is filled with guys like that. Dirk Minifield, you mentioned. He had a strong college career. He had played in the NBA, and drug problems derailed him. He came out of rehab, and he was looking for a second chance, or maybe even his third chance. I don't even know. And the CBA was a chance for him to show the NBA that, he had gotten his head on straight. He had cleaned up. He was still a great player, or he could be a great player. And the CBA was his chance to show it. It didn't work out for him. He was not entirely... he was straight, drug-wise, but he was still battling some psychological demons, I think, and didn't play up to his potential. He played out the string, but basically didn't give it his all, and I think that's the last time he played. So, again, like you say, there are names you vaguely remember that are trying to keep their career going. And again, why do they put up with this, you say, for no money and all this drudgery? Because it beats working. They're still playing basketball. They still have the dream. There's still a small chance. I mean, wouldn't you or I do that if we could as well? It comes to the point where you have to decide either the dream dies or I just can't put up with what it's going to take to get there. And every guy gets to that point at a different time. Give me a sense of the fans, how the team was so, frankly, beloved relative to just about all the other CBA franchises, both before, during, and after. What was about the team and the fans? It seems like there was kind of a strong bond there. There was. And as we talked about, I think it was a mixture of success, luck, a point in time where everything just came together. They've tried to recreate it. The team folded in 92, I believe. I don't know if you want to get into that part of it yet, but it's come back a couple of times. So essentially what happened was, 88, 89, they're coming off a championship year. They have a good year, but they lose in the first round of the playoffs. Next year, they have some success. The year after that, George Karl comes back and coaches them again. They set a league record of 50 victories. But by then, Albany had built an arena downtown, a big modern new arena. It sat like 17,000 people. Now, they played in the Armory, which we haven't really described yet. The Armory was a building that was built in the 19th century. It was literally an armory for the U.S. Army. It was 100 and something years old. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. and it sat 3,000 in folding chairs that they had to set up along the court. It was cold. They didn't put the heat on, so practices were often freezing. You could see your breath while you were practicing. There was a track around it, so joggers would come running around the track while they were practicing. The locker rooms were in the basement. The shower was in the public restroom, so the players would have to walk out of the locker room, which was essentially a storage closet, and go through the crowd that was milling about after the game to get to the showers. It's a minor league gym, really. There were high school gyms that were better than this place, but it had so much character and so much charm, and you put 3,000 people in there, and it's filled to the rafters. And if you got a championship team, I mean, it's a fun place to be.
Sounds like a tough place to play against if you're visiting too, right?
Absolutely, yes. By then, most of the other teams had new arenas downtown. Fancy 10 to 15,000 seat arenas, and they were empty. 3,000 people in the Armory is they're jammed. 3,000, 4,000 people, they're raising the roof. 3,000 people in a 17,000 seat downtown arena, you're lost. You lose all the energy, you lose all the emotion, you lose all the focus. And that was sort of the beginning of the end of the Patroons when they moved to the big arena downtown. They still at first drew their same, 3,000 or so people. But again, you're sitting in essentially an empty arena. You can't hear crowd noise because it's just lost in the echoes. And within 2 years, they were sold and they moved out of town. They moved to another city. A few years after that, the CBA itself folded. But they've resurrected it a couple of times. At least they've tried to. And it's never really taken. They did it once, I don't know, around 2008 maybe, and they got a season or two. And then they're doing it again. The CBA is no longer around, but there is now another Albany Patroons team playing in the Armory again in a league that's now called the Basketball League. The Patroons actually won the championship this year, but it's not the same. You can't recreate the past. There was just something about that time and that place and those teams that everything coalesced, and it really became the place to play in the CBA. Everybody acknowledged that. In fact, it's not just because I was here. It was people around the league said they hoped they could play to Albany. There was one time we were coming back from a practice game in Massachusetts, Pittsfield, Massachusetts. And as you drive from Massachusetts over the New York border and you approach Albany, you take a turn on the highway and you see the Albany skyline. Now, the Albany skyline is not Manhattan. It's not Chicago. It's not San Francisco. But it's a nice little skyline. And Gerald Oliver, who was a CBA lifer for the most part, was waxing poetic about, Albany, so many players want to play here. This is the place everybody wants to go. It is the Los Angeles and the New York of the CBA. And at the time, this was sort of the beginning of the season. This was the preseason, and I was, really? This is Albany. It's a nice little town, but it's Albany. But it was true. Compared to the other places in the CBA, also all very nice little towns, Albany had a reputation in that time, in that place, as being the place to be in the CBA.
Of those other towns, which one stuck out of the road trips that you were able to make as either being interesting for positive or maybe negative reasons?
The towns all tend to be the same after a while. Players go, they check into the cheap hotel, they kill time by going to the local mall, they watch movies, they go to the arena, they practice, they play. So the towns themselves, there wasn't often a lot of time to see. The towns, what I remember is sort of the events. There was a game, I believe it was in Pensacola, where they had given out little soft plastic basketball, giveaway things. And there was a moment in the game where the Pensacola player was called for a foul, and the players or the fans started booing, and a couple of them started tossing these little basketballs on the court. And their coach comes out, grabs the microphone, and in his wacky attempt to calm the crowd, says something like, "I understand your reasonable or your understandable frustration with the refereeing." So the referee, of course, doesn't want to hear that. He runs up to the coach, slaps a tee on him, and tosses him out of the game, at which point every fan in the building starts throwing their little basketballs down on the court. And though the balls were, soft and they weren't going to hurt anybody, it was a little bit frightening. And everybody is standing there, all the patroons are standing there kind of watching these balls come at them until Steve Sharina yells, "George, let's get the fuck out of here." So George says, yeah, everybody in the locker room, and they all run to the locker room, and they wait for the chaos to calm down, and they finally get back out and they play the game. So, it's minor league stuff like that stands out, not the towns themselves, but sort of the events that happened in those towns that were pretty damn funny sometimes.
You mentioned the refs. What about the refs and all of this, right? Because not only are refs not necessarily loved anyway, regardless of what sport and at what level, but here you are, you're playing in, arguably a B league, so to speak, in basketball. I mean, what's that life like? Or did you not get close to them or get into their psyche?
I didn't get close to them, but it's probably not much different. They're not good enough to be in the NBA either. So, the leagues tend to generate the same quality. The players and the refs are the same quality. I play in a beer league, and the refs are as bad as we are. So you sort of find your level, I guess. So the refs were bad. They were inconsistent. There was one time I remember, again, I mentioned Greg Ballard, who was an NBA player. He comes down, and it happened to be a game in the Armory, and Bob Ryan, the great Boston Globe writer, happened to be in town for the game. And Greg Ballard's playing, and he gets called for traveling. And after the game, George Karl and Bob Ryan are talking, and George says, "Can you believe they called that move on Ballard?" And Ryan says, "Yeah, I've seen him make that same move for 10 years in the NBA, and they never called it on him, but they call it on him here." So, that's the kind of stuff you're dealing with in the CBA.
All right, well, let's round the corner on this. Give me a sense of the CBA generally in all of this, right? Because the story is not only that of the patroons and Carl and the players, but it's also about life, in the league itself. This is a time, 88, 89, when the CBA was kind of, there was some movement and some expansion and some decent branding. I mean, you mentioned ESPN for a couple of games on television. It seems like this is around the time when things were kind of trying to sort of gel a little bit, maybe even get things to a higher level and growth sort of spurt for this league. That's my vague recollection of that time. Is that right, or what you remember?
Yeah, I mean, it was, looking back, I think it was the high water mark. Nobody knew it at the time. Of course, everybody thought, well, maybe this can get bigger and better. It didn't, and I'm not 100% sure why that is. It just happened to be that this was as far as it got. This was I guess you would say, the golden age of the CBA. Expansion maybe didn't help. The NBA, I'm not sure exactly when, but they decided to form their own minor league. As you said, it was called the D League, or I'm not sure even what it's called now, but they sort of withdrew their support of the CBA and decided, we can run a minor league ourselves and have more control over it. So that drew some of the better players away from the CBA. It just, like a lot of minor leagues, as your podcast knows, for some reason, these things just don't stay. And it can be a host of reasons you can put your finger on. And sometimes it can just be a mystery. It just faded. I did not follow the CBA into the future, so I can't really speak to exactly what brought it down, but this was the high watermark of the CBA for whatever reason.
So the team wins the division. They sort of bow out relatively early in the playoffs relative to what they had done the season before. So how does the Patroons season wrap up? Obviously, there's some tragedy in the league itself, which maybe we want to talk about, and how does this book project get signed, sealed, and then ultimately delivered into the world? And I guess I'll ask what the reception is and was, and all of that, having been your first book and all the excitement and or anticipation of such. So it's a lot to ask in one question, but feel free to start wherever you want.
So they have a good season, but by the end of the season, the team is in disarray. George Karl has brought in a lot of players. He's mixed and matched. He's disrupted a lot of the rotations. Players who have been here all year are resentful of the players that have come in late. The team loses all its cohesion, and they lose in the first round of the playoffs. The season ends, and players go their separate ways. Like I said earlier, these guys are on 6-month contracts, and when the season ends, you got to go look for another job. So part of the book is about, all right, what do you do next? My lead character is this coach, Gerald Oliver. I open and close with the book. The book opens when Gerald Oliver is looking for a job. He's in his 50s. He's been a coach his whole life in the college, in the pros. But he's still living a year-to-year existence. He's got to find a job. He manages to find a job with Albany. At the end of the year, same thing. They're all basically, George Karl doesn't know what he's going to do. Gerald Oliver doesn't know what he's going to do. All these players don't know what they're going to do. So many of them just go off not knowing. It turns out that George decides to take a job in Europe. He coaches over in Madrid. The Patroons keep Gerald Oliver, and they name him the coach for the next year. And some of the players come back. A lot of them don't. And it's just, you do it all over again. What am I going to do next season? What's my job? So the book itself, as I said, I wrote as I went. I did not have the luxury of taking a lot of time. I kept it as a diary, and I submitted every month as a chapter to my publisher, and they would edit it, and we'd work on it. But there wasn't a whole lot of revising. And in fact, the book was already in production as the season was ending. So as I remember it, I had to kind of hustle through the last week or two and to get the final story in and wrap it all up as the book was going to press. You mentioned a tragedy. While the book was in production, the commissioner at the time was a guy named Jay Ramsdell, and he tragically died in a plane crash in Chicago over that summer. So before the book came out, I put a little dedication in the front, kind of dedicating the book to him. I didn't really have a lot of contact with him because I saw my job as being with the team. So when the team interacted with him, he would be in the story, but it was not about interviewing him and getting his take on what the CBA was. But still, it was a terrible loss. He was a very young man. He had done a lot to improve the conditions of the league. He was very well respected. And that was kind of a sad footnote to this book. So to finish up, I finished the book. I send the chapters in. It takes a few months to produce a book. And it came out to generally very favorable reviews. Like most books on the minor leagues, it didn't sell a whole hell of a lot, but those who bought it seemed to have liked it. And, for me, it was a very proud moment. You only have one first book, and this was mine, and I'm very proud of it. And I think it captures a moment in time in a league that doesn't exist anymore, and players who are now middle-aged and older. And, they look back on it fondly. As I said, I saw Steve Sharina a few months ago, and I asked him, did I get it right? And he said 100%. So that made me feel really good. He lived it. I just watched it, but he thinks that I captured it at least the way he saw it. So, I'm pretty proud of that.
Well, I love the book, and I've had it for almost 30 years now, sitting on my bookshelf, and just even the cover of it, I think, is great. It's a tremendous dark color photo, and you see three of the players. I can't identify which ones they are.
I'll tell you, it's on the left, it's Dirk Minifield. The center is Steve Sharina, and the right is Clinton Smith, who is a whole character and a half. He should have been in a book himself, who we didn't get to talk to. But if you look in the back, there are two people sitting in the stands in the dark. I'm one of them. Just for a little trivia, if you're ever. Actually, it'll never come up anywhere, so never mind. But I'm one of the guys posed in the stands.
That's hilarious because and you see all the sort of dark green folding chairs that you were mentioning, and that obviously that was not one of the more well attended days or evenings.
Well, that was a setup shot. That was to capture the feeling of the CBA. In fact, Albany was almost always sold out. That was sort of it's not a fair representation of Albany, but it's a fair representation of some of the other arenas. They were never that sparsely populated, but there were plenty of empty seats on many nights. So obviously the picture is supposed to give you a sense that these guys are doing their best and they're not getting a whole lot of attention.
All right. Well, there we go. It took us an hour and change to get to the expose that we were looking for. Was this photo on the cover staged or an action reel shot? All right,
guilty as charged.
So, all right. So now just a couple of curiosities to wrap up, if you'll indulge me. So the book comes out. Obviously, I'm sure you did some promotion for it. You probably, like most authors, are concerned that the publisher's not promoting it enough, or you're hoping it's going to sell and it doesn't sell as much as maybe you want it to. The book is out of print, and as our audience knows at the top and the bottom of our show, we've already, we'll promote it, of course, some more, but it's certainly available out there if you can find it and look for it. I mean, there are plenty of used bookstores out there. But what happens to a book like this once it goes out of its print run? Do you get to keep those rights? Does the publisher, whether the publisher even exists anymore, what happens to your story given that it's not in print anymore?
That's a heck of a question. I'll have to ask my agent. It's never really been an issue. For a while, I kept the rights. The book was actually optioned for film a couple of times. Unfortunately, it never went anywhere. Nothing ever happened. But, so I did negotiate with a couple of film production companies to see if we could make a movie out of it. Sadly, it didn't happen. At this point, now that it's out of print, I'm not sure who has the rights. It might be me. Call me. If anybody wants to call me or call my agent, we can talk.
Well, that's kind of part. I mean, look, David, you'd be surprised who listens to this show. I mean, we're 2+ years into this now, and I'm amazed now at sort of the velocity of the people, and they tell two friends and so on and so on. And look, we've stumbled across a number of different stories and situations that, either directly in a sort of a direct telling, historical presence of the story, or maybe as a backdrop. Perhaps like Will Ferrell did with the ABA, as a comic scene set for, the life and times either of a period like the late 80s or minor league basketball in general or that kind of stuff. And then the hilarity that ensues. You'd be surprised. And my hope is that a few more people in this conversation will discover, either remember or maybe, newly find this thing called the CBA and the Albany Patroons, which, as you alluded to, right, is a brand and a basketball team that still lives on, admittedly in a even smaller, more minor league kind of way. But there's something there that I would imagine people in the capital region certainly remember, at least the name, the brand. Maybe there were some that do actually remember the team. And that's, we kind of revel in some of that stuff, and you never know, frankly, what's going to transpire. Hence the question, and maybe a few contacts to come from it, we hope.
Yeah, well, I hope so too. Like I say, other people have thought it would make a movie. I think it'd be a great movie. As far as reading the book, you don't have to know the players or the coaches or even the team. It's really a story about minor league sports, and minor league sports stories are timeless. You can watch Bull Durham, every year, and it's always funny. You can watch, I'm drawing a blank, but there are other minor league, Slapshot. These are fiction, of course, but you get a sense of what minor league life is like. I think this book gives us a sense of what minor league life is like. It tells you about some real characters. I think you get to learn about some of the people and the lives they lived during these 6 months. Their highs and their lows. Their interactions, how they deal with stress, some well, some not so well. It is hilarious at times. It's really poignant at times. And like I said, I think it's not about wins and losses. It's not about who shot the most, 3-pointers, though there is some game stuff, of course, because that is what they're there for. But there's a lot less actual basketball in there than so you don't need to know who the players are. What you really need is an interest in this slice of life and this world that most of us don't get a chance to look at very closely.
Well, I think this book plus the documentary that came out, I think last year, they called The Minor League Mecca, which I have yet to see, which is about the Patroons from, I think, a couple of seasons, I think maybe after yours.
No, actually, it was before. Yeah, well, yes, this film talks about the beginning of the team through these years and up to its first demise. Yes, a local guy put together a documentary. As far as I know, he's trying to pitch it to distributors or film festivals. I'm not sure how he's done with it. It's a nice film. It's a documentary. There's some great stories in that too. I hope it gains a wide audience. They had a screening here in Albany over the winter. That George Karl came in, Steve Sharina came in, other players from the past came in. Phil Jackson couldn't come, but he sent a video, welcome, or not a welcome, but he said hello by video, wishing he could have been there. He doesn't travel much anymore because he's got such bad hips. But it was a great event, and to your point, Albany still loves the Patroons. It was incredibly well attended. It got a lot of press. People remember that era very fondly. They keep trying to resurrect it. That's how much they think of it. It hasn't taken, though, because you just can't recreate the past.
All right, last thing. What are you up to now? What are you working on? Any ideas in and around sports or basketball again, or just in general? What are you up to, and where can we find more about you and your various doings?
Well, I'm still a freelance writer. I don't do a whole lot of sports anymore. The business of publishing has changed, as you may or may not know.
Just
so there isn't a whole lot of outlets out there for freelance sports writers, at least not that pay a living wage. The fun thing is, though, I have a new book coming out early next year. It's my first book in 25 years. I have been a contributing writer for a local magazine. I live in the Hudson Valley of New York State, so the magazine is appropriately called Hudson Valley Magazine. And I've been writing about the history of the Hudson Valley for the past 10 or 12 years, basically from the age of the dinosaurs, when the Hudson Valley was in the middle of the ocean, up until present time. And I've covered all kinds of things. The Hudson Valley is a remarkably rich area for history, from the Revolutionary War to Henry Hudson himself to just remarkable things have happened to the robber barons who lived in the valley in their big houses along the river. So anyway, I'm having a slew of my articles collected into a book. It will be called The Hudson Valley, the First 250 Million Years, and it's being published by Globe Pequot Press, and it comes out early 2020. So, like I said, that's my first book in 25 years, so I'm very excited about that.
Well, congratulations, and it's ironic that we're dragging you back to your very first book. There seems to be some kind of balance to that now, doesn't there?
Yes, I never said I would never write a book again, but I never said I would either. So this has been a very happy coincidence, and I'm really looking forward to seeing it again, going on the book tours, which are a lot of fun. It's great because books. I write for magazines. I write for websites. They're very ephemeral. Books last forever. Like you said, you've had this book on your shelf for however many, 20, 30 years. Magazines are gone in a month. Websites disappear instantly. Books are, kind of forever. So I'm still old-fashioned enough to like being able to pick something up and look at it and flip pages and go back to it later in life. And so it's fun to be back in that book world again.
Well, I'm just sorry I didn't get to have an excuse to do something to kind of remember it and talk about it until I discovered this podcasting thing. But I highly encourage all of our listeners to find a copy of this book. It is generally available, obviously, and sadly, David's not going to financially benefit, at least until it gets reissued. But it is out there. It is it's a scream of a read, and I'm hopeful that this episode will. I will have done my job if somebody, when your new book comes out next year, comes up to one of your book signings with this book instead and looks for its signature.
I would love that. That would be wonderful. And yes, there are copies on Amazon. They will not set you back much, a couple of bucks probably at this point. And I think you'll have a fun time reading it. Even my wife read it, and she has no interest in sports whatsoever, and she was laughing out loud. She was asking me questions. Now, of course, she's my wife. You might say, well, she has to do that. Well, you don't know my wife, so she doesn't have to do that, but she did. So I think if it's good enough for her, I think it'll be good enough for your readers. It really is, and I say this with all humility. It's pretty damn funny.
All right, our thanks to David Levine. What a fascinating conversation and an equally fascinating topic. Again, the name of the book is called Life on the Rim, A Year in the Continental Basketball Association. It is sadly and tragically out of print. It was originally published by Macmillan, and while we work on trying to figure out a way to get the rights for this book back and hopefully at some point reissue the book for more people to enjoy. And by the way, there are a lot of other titles out there that sort of fallen into that sort of into that realm, and that's going to be a little sort of mini crusade of ours as the months roll on. So stay tuned for some activity around that. But in the meantime, do yourself a favor and get a copy of this book in used fashion. Probably the best way to do that is to go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Search up this episode with David Levine, and you'll see a link to Amazon and maybe a few other sources where you can very inexpensively find a used copy of this book. This book has been sitting on my bookshelf for, almost 25 years now. It stood out because it's a great story of a full year's ride into this crazy league that, as the years pile on, people sort of forget. And it was seminal in many respects for some of the classic people and names and coaches and players that came out of that league and into NBA and beyond greatness. But again, go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com and you can buy a copy of that book used. And you can also do a bunch of other things on our website too while you're there. Why don't you? You can find all of our social media feeds there. On Twitter, you'll find us at Good Seats Still. On Instagram, of course, you'll find us at Good Seats Still Available. You will find a link to our Facebook page that's devoted to our little show. You can send us some email, either directly from the site or just directly from your email server at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. You can also, on our website, sign up for our little weekly newsletter. Why don't you? That's our little sort of hint into what's going to be on the show the following week. So maybe a little early advance warning. You'd be interested in that. And lots more to come, again, on that website. So bookmark that and come back early and often. goodseatsstillavailable.com. One last thing, of course, we want to say our continued thanks to our friends at Podfly Productions. Of course, in particular, our friend Jerry Payne and his team at Podfly. Again, you can find out more about them at podfly.net. Okay, that's it for me. I appreciate your listening. And until next week, we'll see ya. And until then, our ticket window is now closed. Take care.